and the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. Freedom, liberty, these values seem to be central to the ideology of the Western world today. The rousing American anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, the Statue of Liberty holding its torch, these symbols stand for political values that many Americans regard as foundational, and for which the NATO alliance has repeatedly gone to war. And yet the relationship between freedom and politics is an odd one, for freedom has often been seen as the opposite of politics, the absence of politics. French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued in the 18th century that freedom is what we all possess in our state of nature, and what modern politics tends to encroach upon. Most classical liberals have suggested that being free means keeping political interference in people's lives to a minimum. The government is best that governs least. This saying is often ascribed to Thomas Jefferson, author of the US Constitution. Although Jefferson himself almost certainly didn't actually utter this sentence, it is no accident that it has been widely attributed to him. It is seen as the basis of the American idea of freedom. But it's not confined to America. Indeed, it's crossed many geographical, chronological and ideological boundaries. Calls to restrict the state from encroaching on our freedom abound. Edmund Burke, 18th century critic of the French Revolution and founding father of modern British conservatism, wrote that it is in the power of the state to prevent much evil, but it can do very little positive good. Thomas Paine, human rights activist and one of Burke's main political adversaries in the British Parliament, who later emigrated to America to support the American Revolution, had very similar thoughts on the relationship between freedom and politics. Government, he wrote, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. And Jeremy Bentham, a famous 19th century British utilitarian thinker and a foundational figure in the history of British liberalism, advised the state to be quiet. To be sure, this idea of freedom also has many critics. Revolutionaries of the left and the right have argued that people are subject to repressive forces such as the exploitative logic of capitalism, alienation, colonialism and so forth, which we can only overcome through politics, even through political force. Their notions of freedom are thus politically produced. Freedom becomes possible only as a product of political struggles. We shall talk much more about such approaches together in the coming 5 weeks of this course. But today, I want to invite you to reflect on whether this classical liberal notion of freedom is really as non-political as it seems. So whose freedom are we talking about? There's of course the obvious point that if you associate freedom with one particular nation state, there's a perilously close line between the defense of the freedom of all the world's citizens and the defense of the freedoms of one particular nation's citizens, over and above, perhaps even at the expense of, the freedom of others. But there's also the question of whether freedom from politics really means that we can do what we like. This question has attracted most academic attention in the last 20 years or so. The works of the French philosopher Michel Foucault have been particularly influential for those who wanted to explore what being free actually means in practice. Foucault argued that in order for modern liberal societies to function without direct state control and repression, citizens needed to be conditioned to think and behave in ways that made them easily governable. Moreover, they would also control each other in the exercise of this self-discipline through a system of mutual surveillance. One powerful metaphor that Foucault identified for how this process operated was the panopticon you see here. It was designed by the utilitarian liberal thinker Jeremy Bentham in the mid-19th century for prisons, but also insane asylums, schools, hospitals and factories. Instead of using direct coercion through threat and punishment, Bentham suggested that structures such as these achieved control of behavior much more efficiently. In the panopticon, those who are to be controlled are simultaneously isolated, no inmate here has any contact, even visual, with another inmate, and exposed to the constant watchful gaze of the guards from their vantage point in the high central tower, unseen by the prisoners. This combination of isolation and constant observation would create a consciousness of helplessness and surveillance, which would prevent disobedience more effectively, Bentham thought, than any direct force. You can perhaps imagine that effect best if you think about the modern open-plan office. This is not a place where disciplinarian managers are wandering around shouting at disobedient employees, preventing them from chatting or skiving. Rather, we police one another. The presence of direct authority is replaced by the watchful gaze of our co-workers. They observe us, we observe them, and in this way a seemingly free workplace becomes a place in which very little deviance from standardized working patterns is thinkable. For Foucault, the modern liberal state functions in a similar way. We are not coerced into behaving as the state wishes us to behave. Rather, we internalize certain liberal beliefs as seemingly self-evident truth, and we learn to control and repress all those desires that do not fit into the ideal liberal order. We also learn to police one another by embracing social norms such as rationality and respectability, and by ostracizing those who do not comply with them. Such behaviors, Foucault argued, make those of us who live in liberal states governable in ways that are decidedly political, but that now appear to be non-political, through infrastructures of surveillance, not just physical structures like the panopticon or modern urban planning, but also through administrative infrastructures such as census data, visas, pensions, insurance schemes, and so forth. Certain liberal behaviors are institutionalized as common sense. Historian Patrick Joyce summarized this process as moving from a state where rulers curtail our freedoms to the rule of freedom. Freedom itself, it is what disciplines us into political conformity. In this vein, then, freedom is not the opposite of politics. It is merely one way of exercising political power and of following one political ideology. Before we explore the theme in more detailed case studies, we'd like you to take a quick look at the suggested readings by Michel Foucault and Patrick Joyce and share your thoughts with us and the other learners online. In the next film, Matt will talk us through different conceptions of freedom. And finally, we will ask you to upload an image of what symbolizes true freedom for you. I look forward to our discussions.